this session is really two sessions, or two parts, grouped, albeit loosely, into two themes. The first theme of presentations is around how experts or institutions that are focused really specifically on genetics, maybe even specifically on germline editing, are engaging with stakeholders in the public. The next session will be more focused on mechanisms of engagement, and you'll hear from some folks who, genetics, gene editing might be part of their portfolio, but more generally they're thinking about how do you engage and through what mechanisms. Again, loose categorization, because I think everyone on this session in both parts is thinking about all of these things. Just a reminder that biographies for speakers are actually available on the online program at IGI, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on intros. I'm just going to tell you who's in this first round, and after we hear each of their 5-minute talks, they've really hammered that in, their 5 minutes, we're going to sit down, do some Q&A. I might ask a couple questions, and we want your questions as well, and then we'll kind of do it again. So I'm just going to tell you who's in this round. We're going to save all the other intros for the online bios. So you're going to hear first from Jennifer Merchant, who's going to be speaking about ARIGE. You'll hear from Katie Hassan, who's at the Center for Genetics and Society. You'll hear from Samira Kiani, who is with the University of Pittsburgh, Kelly Ormond, who's at Stanford University, and then you'll hear from Ben Hurlbut, who you've seen before, but he's going to speak specifically to the Global Observatory, and he's at Arizona State. So we're just going to have you come up in succession and start with Jennifer.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Ben, for inviting me, and welcome to everybody. I was expecting to speak to 300 people, but actually this turns out to be nice too. It's more intimate. I'm going to be talking to you about ARIGE, which is a nonprofit association, an international association for responsible research and innovation in genome editing. And we had our kickoff meeting on March 23rd, 2018. And this association was created with the following aims. And then I'll talk to you a little bit about who makes up this association, and anybody can join, including you. These are the 5 aims of ARIGE. First, to foster the development of these techniques in a safe and ethical framework, to foster especially an inclusive debate with risk management approach, promote global governance of genome editing by including all stakeholders, creating an ethical toolbox, which is something that is the more pragmatic aspect of the association, and informal guidance for genome editing, and developing a robust particular reflection on the role of the lay public. So as you can see here, public engagement is a very important aspect of the association. We launched our association first with the publication of an article that you might have read in Transgenic Research, which lays out these various aims that I mentioned. Right now, actually, we have approximately 400 members on our listserv, our email listserv, and these members come from almost every continent, as you can see, mostly from Europe, but also from Africa and South America. I think the only country that is absent, one large country, is Russia. And the idea, indeed, this reflects really what one of our goals was or is, and that is to bring in people from around the world, not just an Anglo-American sort of approach to things, which we feel has been the case up until now. And once we got the 400 email listservs, we then made a call for membership. So we now have 87 individual members, and these are the countries. And we also have 16 institutional members. And I forgot to bring with me the names of the institutions, but I can get that for you. We were featured shortly after the launching of the association in Science, and so the reference is up there. We were also featured in Nature Biotechnology with, again, this idea of it being a more global-oriented association. We were also featured in the CRISPR journal. And almost last but not least, after Hong Kong, we issued a statement, as I'm sure many organisms, and I know many organisms and organizations and state governments did, condemning the activity of, or what was announced by Dr. He. and calling for, of course, more responsible and a more robust framework, internationally speaking, on CRISPR use. Our next meeting is going to be on November 14th in Paris, and this is how you can contact us. I didn't put the agenda up there because I didn't have time, and I won't have time to tell you, but I do want to mention that we will be hearing from Dan Carlson from Recombinetics USA, who is going to come and talk to us about the cattle that turned out to not be exactly what they were hoping for when they proceeded with gene editing in this particular experiment. And so that's going to be interesting because we're going to hear from a stakeholder, a scientist, who's going to come and speak to us and, talk about his responsibility in this and maybe enlighten, of course, certainly enlighten all of us in this march forward towards more responsible and innovation in CRISPR technology. Thank you.
Hello. I'd also like to thank the organizers for having me here. I am here representing the Center for Genetics and Society, which is a public interest nonprofit organization, independent organization that is located right here in Berkeley. And our mission is to bring a social justice perspective to public conversations around human genetic technologies and reproductive technologies. And in our work, the question of how to engage the public comes back to this broader question that we were discussing earlier, throughout the earlier panels: who decides and how, right? That it's not a question of public engagement for the sake of it or to tick a box, but really that this should be something that goes to questions of shared decision-making, right? That the public should be taken into account as decisions are being made. And also that it shouldn't be a decision just maybe for scientists or even bioethicists to decide, or even to decide which are the questions that the public gets to decide, right? That we want to push for a more open form of public engagement, open scope, where all of the questions are really on the table, right? That we can think about what are the questions that we are engaging in rather than delimiting them in advance. And it also means that we should be deliberate and inclusive about thinking who is at the table for these discussions. And so what I want to focus on in talking about part of how CGS engages the public is in thinking about how we understand the public or the publics that would be engaged. Not to think about the public as kind of an undifferentiated mass, or they sort of exist in a vacuum, or that it's groups of sort of atomized individuals, right, each with an opinion that should be tallied, right? But we want to focus on an aspect of publics that aren't often thought about when we talk about public engagement. And that is is groups that are already engaged in a range of important social issues that are very relevant to the questions that we are discussing around heritable human genome editing, right? Groups and organizations that are attuned to and already engaged on issues of inequality and social justice that should be part of this conversation. So we talk about this as engaging civil society, right? Thinking about what are the groups that are already active in this area and how can we bring them into these conversations? How can we make sure that these perspectives are heard, right, in public conversations? So we're thinking about groups working on women's health and reproductive justice, racial and economic justice, disability rights, LGBTQ equality, the environment, indigenous groups, right? All of these can be and should be engaged in these conversations. So I'll show a few examples of how we've been doing this, right? A sort of sliver of what we've been doing in this area. Two examples are coming from a series of webinars that we've done on human gene editing and particular social issues. And these are either online or later in-person public events that are co-sponsored by public interest and social justice organizations that are designed to explore the intersection of human genome editing and urgent social issues. And our webinars are actually available online on YouTube and on our website if you're interested in seeing how they went. And I want to highlight just a few of the benefits of approaching public engagement in this way, right, through the concerns of different civil society sectors. One is that the conversation can potentially start in a different place, right? It could include the history of the issue itself, right? The conversations that have happened around genetic modification that go back before 2015, before CRISPR, right? The laws that are already in existence. It can take into account more of the historical and social context that these technologies are being developed in and in which they might be used, right? Rather than, focusing in the beginning only on the technical issues, but what are the histories, what are the social and commercial contexts in the areas where these technologies are being developed that would come out if we approach it in this way. So focusing on something like reproductive justice brings histories of racial and gender oppression into the forefront as we talk about these issues. We had another webinar on disability justice and human genetic engineering that explored the diversity of opinions and perspectives and concerns that you can find even within a community delineated as disability community. Another advantage is to think about the ways that issues intersect. So we can talk about climate crisis, we can talk about concerns around genetic engineering. This is a talk that we had here at Berkeley just last week. So if we think about what becomes visible when we engage civil society, I would say historical and social context, the intersection of issues, and the possibility of social change, that outcomes are not inevitable in advance. Thanks.
So I start with a trailer of the documentary film, which originally started to be named as Code of the Wild, but it's now called The Human Game.
Imagine any characteristic in a human being and you want to modify it.
How long will I live now? I'm 51. Is there a chance that this gene therapy is going to extend my life, or is it only for people being born now?
Demonstrations in animals of aging reversal. So you can see a wide variety of biomarkers.
What I'm looking for is where gene editing is headed. And more the answer is China. I went to China to find out what was happening. It's a world of breadcrumbs. It's finding needles and stacks of needles. I mean, there's so much information.
He is what's left of investigative journalism.
He wants to tell a story.
Feel like he wants to tell a story.
This is part of our efforts to reverse aging in humans. So I've been involved for over a decade with companies in China.
People look to George Church. He's got gravitational pull in the genomics field.
There's kind of this public world, and then there's what's actually happening.
Is something I'm gonna do or is something I'm gonna sell gonna hurt somebody? I've never thought about it.
Anybody can use gene editing. I've been here for a week and I found 3 people editing human embryos. There's a cover-up. Babies whose genomes have been mutated as part of the international science race. When you press publish, you can't take it back.
Chinese researcher has created an international controversy over the world's first genetically edited babies.
Named Lulu and Nana.
Your story forced a conversation.
The accusation now is that you've broken the law.
I don't need credit for it, but I do need to be first.
As human beings, have never been able to decide what genes we get.
For this person, it's not dystopia. That's utopia.
So the biggest issue is just how quickly this technology is evolving.
So moving fast forward, because I have 2 minutes, I'm going to introduce to you that it's possible to make a documentary film that is about 80 minutes, but you also need to engage public in a deeper conversation. So in order to do that, we developed a web platform that we call Tomorrow Live. The idea of this is that you will share a video in your social media. People watch it, but when they click on it, they are directed to this web page and they are watching this video. Does it have, you should have audio too, but maybe you don't hear that.
Basically, we are way too
You can
for
read information
Dr.
about
J.K.
that, you can
Hayes,
like it,
talk.
but then you can
I would
click
like
on the
to,
links and explore different
maybe ask,
storylines that exist
Dr. K, to come to the
beneath
stage.
this certain video. You can add that individual clip or the whole stack into your stack platform, where you are able to kind of rearrange the video. You can go back and watch another set of video. When you watch those, you can actually really explore different context or different content of these videos. And then ultimately, you can add that clip or the whole clip again into your stack. And now you have the whole stack of different videos. You can, as I said, rearrange them, or you can kind of like edit them and shorten them. And then you can preview them. Sometimes you can add audio or music to them. And once you have preview all these video, you can go to your publish app over there. And then you can publish, you can choose one of these images as your poster image. You can add information about that. And then basically, you can easily share that in your social media as a response back to that original video that you watched. So this is a way that we are exploring to engage people in a two-way conversation. We believe that film and media is a transformative way of actually making people interested in a topic. So I'm just gonna stop here because it's over. Thank you.
I want to start by saying that the work I'm going to talk about really comes from the background that I grew up in, sort of professionally speaking. So initially, I trained as a genetic counselor and have worked with patients in prenatal and reproductive settings, as well as through all stages of the lifespan. So really spending lots of my time working with families who are dealing with genetic illness. I also come from a background of clinical medical ethics, where we work through conflicts with individual families and situations. And as part of my role as the training program director in genetic counseling at Stanford, as well as having been involved in the ASHG gene editing statement, one of the things that became really clear to me was we needed some empirical research in this area. So I'm going to quickly present some of the work we've started to do in that front. And I will acknowledge all of this is student work and it's been published, so you can certainly follow up by looking at this. This first paper that I'll mention came in 2016 and 2017, after all of these professional statements that you were hearing about sort of came out and the National Academy comments and things like that. We wanted to think about what professionals who worked in genetics thought about gene editing, because nobody really knew at the time. So we attempted to do a survey of this population, of course being biased by the fact that we had to use mailing lists for professional societies, and that's a really narrow scope of who it is, but we tried to do so globally. We think 13,000 people got our email. We got about 500 responses, so you can draw your own conclusions about generalizability there. But we did see a number of things that I want to point out. And again, keep in mind that even though we just published this is data from late 2016 and early 2017, okay? So if you look at the table on the left, the basic science and somatic related questions were on the top, and something like 90 to 99% of our study respondents said they were pretty supportive of research and of somatic gene editing, which wasn't a big surprise. As you get down onto the bottom, we started to look at basic science research and then clinical translation in embryos, so the germline gene editing. And we went from 88% basic science research support for non-viable human embryo research to 32% who actually at that time thought that clinical translation of germline gene editing was acceptable. So at the time we were like, wow, that seems really high. I suppose it explains some things that have happened since, but still higher than what I would have predicted. We tried to flesh out, and I don't know how well this is projecting in the back, but we tried to flesh out how nuanced people's attitudes towards this were. So we played around with things like how penetrant a condition is, how significant the impairments are, whether or not it would lead to a fatal condition, whether or not it was treatable, and also prevalence. And everything except prevalence changed the way people thought about its acceptability. So we thought at least this tells us that people have some nuance to what they're thinking about. It's not just a global, yeah, that's great, or no, that's not great. And then we looked at how people compared somatic and germline gene editing. I'll just tell you that the pink and the purple were things that were considered acceptable, and we had somatic and germline, same categories of therapeutic or medical treatments to enhancement, which had much less support in both. We did a study and actually included one of our other speakers for this afternoon in this work where we wanted to start thinking about conditions where gene editing or gene therapies were happening. So we surveyed families and did interviews who had congenital or acquired visual impairment. And what we saw here actually really goes back to what Gregor said this morning. Individuals who have different impairments view these treatments through the lens of their life. So if you felt that visual impairment was your identity, you were a lot less likely to be interested in gene editing. And if you were a person who had an acquired visual impairment, you might think, can you please fix this? And that was really related in that way. Most recently, we followed up with an additional study where we interviewed people who had kids with trisomy 21 Down syndrome, or trisomy 13 and 18, which are much more significant and rarer conditions. And we asked them what they thought about these theoretical treatments. And in general, people said, if you could fix this medical thing, that might be good. But I'm really worried about the safety and effectiveness. And also, particularly for the families who had kids with Down syndrome, they really thought their kids already had a good quality of life. So if we weren't talking about a condition that had a much more significant impairment and shortened life expectancy, what we saw was a lot of conflict. And I'll refer you to the paper. Unfortunately, I forgot my sheets of paper that had these fabulous quotes. But what we were really hearing was, part of me wants to maybe improve my child's communication or help them live a better life or maybe just make it easier for them, but I don't want to change my child. And so again, it's not black and white for these families. And I think that we really need to continue to explore all of this. We tried to summarize some of this work and other work from some of my colleagues in a paper. And I think the qualified optimism and the trick around how they navigate it is the real challenge that we're going to have to struggle with as a society. I'll end there. Thank you.
Hello again. So as I mentioned in my opening comments, this phrase came out of the work of the International Summit in 2015, the notion that a broad societal consensus is required to move forward with human germline genome editing. And as I said, I think that this is a worthy aspiration, and yet it raises a host of questions. So which society or societies? You might think of that in national terms, but also in terms of professional groups, in terms of different civil society contingents. Who sets the terms of debate? Who identifies stakes and designates stakeholders? And what questions are the questions and what other questions go unasked? So these, of course, all raise questions about how we should do things. But at the same time, they raise questions about how we do things. Since certain societies are privileged, certain terms of debate are authorized and privileged, et cetera, et cetera. Some questions go unasked. So what would be needed to move towards something that we could call broad societal consensus, or at least an aspiration towards it? Well, first of all, an expanded range of questions that one needs to seek after the forms of consensus that are not about the sort of yes or no question, but about the ways we ask questions, who's included in those discussions, what's at stake, and so forth. And that expanding rather than contracting the range of questions can facilitate that process. Furthermore, a wider range of perspectives and forms of expertise, international, interdisciplinary, and cross-sectoral, engaging in forms of dialogue that they may not otherwise engage in normal practices and in normal settings. Inclusive deliberation that draws upon as wide as possible a range of human experience and moral imagination. So in order to not make these questions simple, but to make them enriched and inclusive. Global dialogue, because the questions that are at stake in this domain of technology, like in many others, are questions that touch upon humanity as such, are global by their very nature. So a global dialogue that expands cross-cultural awareness and lays foundations for what you might call a cosmopolitan bioethics, a bioethics that's built around awareness and at least an aspiration to understand each other and the diversity of approaches that can be brought to the same sorts of questions. And that this in turn requires an infrastructure that's missing. An infrastructure to recognize and facilitate a larger variety of mechanisms of deliberation in the service of governance. The sort of sense that there was a need for these, or at least questions need to be asked about them, led me and several collaborators, including Sheila Jasanoff, who will speak in the next panel, to organize a meeting at Harvard a couple of years ago. And what we tried to do in that meeting was to begin not with questions about the technology and what we should do about it, but questions about the different ways of asking questions about the human, about human integrity, and about what warrants protection by whom in what ways, and what are the ways of arriving at judgments about what is good and bad for the human. And that then to situate questions about this technology, could be any technology, in those broader conversations, which of course are diverse across different human communities and cultures. And one of the things that came out of that meeting was a consensus. You might call it a broad societal consensus in our own little social group, that we didn't know enough about each other. That there was a need for a greater engagement and recognition, even among the small group of sort of elite experts that we had gathered together for that conversation. And that a kind of infrastructure for building bases for engagement and learning was necessary. And out of that came the proposal for what we've called a global observatory for gene editing, something that's not in the business of giving advice, but in the business of looking and seeing and seeking to understand the different ways of engaging with the fundamental questions that are at stake in this domain, such that all of us in our parochialism and ignorance can learn from one another and do better. So the three mechanisms of this project, which is in the process of transitioning from aspiration to an actualized enterprise, a harder process than it's easy to propose and basically hard to get somebody to write a check to make it happen. But the three primary functions are to collect the perspectives. What's going on? What are the ways of thinking that exist out there that some voices speak louder than others? We need a mechanism for collecting and making visible deliberative and governance activities around the world, to analyze the foundations of thought, not just what are the rules, how are things treated differently, but how and why. From whence do those judgments come, and what can we learn from them? And finally, to convene a greater diversity of voices, in particular exclusive voices that are excluded. So to convene conversations that are not only within science and among scientists, not only within sort of authorized professional ethics, not only amongst stakeholders that have been designated by somebody who thinks they have a complete mapping of what's at stake and who the stakeholders are, and not only secular perspectives, but drawing upon the whole repertoire of moral and religious imagination through which human communities and cultures make sense of the issues that are at stake here. Because after all, those issues are fundamental questions of what is right and good for human lives. The last thing I forgot to say is you've heard enough from me. And so I'm going to beg out of this panel discussion. And if you have questions about this enterprise, hopefully my partner in crime, Sheila Jasanoff, who's on the next panel, will speak to them.
Thank you for that and for kind of helping us dive into some of the nuts and bolts of the different way engagement is happening. I want to ask a few questions, but then I do want to know what questions folks in the audience have, as well as those who are watching online. First of all, I want to just pick up on this idea of kind of self-selection. Kelly, you kind of mentioned it explicitly. When you start reaching out to folks to say, what's your opinion? Not everybody responds. And Jennifer, I was curious, as you were talking about your outreach and how you've invited everyone in, but not everybody always comes. How do you think about or navigate the reality of self-selection in the outreach that you're doing? How does that get embedded into your analysis of what you're hearing, or not?
Well, thanks for the question. I think our main challenge at Arige, indeed, is to have people come who normally wouldn't. And to that end, we have already, for our previous meeting and for the one that is upcoming, we are offering grants and paying for the ways from people who are coming from low-income, middle-income countries. And this thanks to the support of public monies from the state, from France, from the INSERM, which is the equivalent of the NIH, And even from private companies, which we obviously do not reject. And if they can help us out financially, we are more than willing to take on their contribution. And I think that is one of the reasons then why we can be able to say that we are trying not to self-select, but to open up the selection to as many people as possible by helping those who are coming from countries such as Senegal or South America, et cetera. And we have our grants already in place for the next meeting. They've been sent out. They've financed the venue of some of these people. So we're very happy about that.
Thanks. So you spoke a bit to how you get people into the room. What if you just still can't get them, Kelly? How do you interpret your results?
I think for us, we find we get both ends of this spectrum because those are the people who have very strong feelings on one end or the other. And it's a lot harder to get the middle and to know how big the middle is. So, of course, when we do our interview studies, we're always looking for data saturation and that we've sort of gotten to the point where we're not hearing new attitudes. And then, truth be told, you just have to know that there are limitations to all of the work you can do and beat the bushes as much as you can to get the breadth. I guess that's my best answer there.
Great, thanks. Building off of that a little bit, Katie, you kind of mentioned, I think Ben picked up on this as well, that as you start to talk about questions of germline editing or genome editing more generally, some of these questions reach back into history, reach out into broader societal contexts that speak to questions of technology and science in general. And so you brought that up in your presentation, and I guess my question for you is, given that, can we really tackle germline editing as a starting place, or do we need to be answering other questions in other forums and other ways first? How do you see the relationship between the two?
Yeah, the questions around germline editing are not only around germline editing. And, I think that a pathway to a broader conversation is to start with some of the questions and concerns and the history and the ways that people are already engaged in their political lives, right? To think about how the questions that we're asking about germline editing are questions that we can ask about other things as well. And that means it goes in the opposite direction as well. Like we could start with broader questions about, what kind of world, what kind of society do we want to live in? What things have blocked us from getting there? What things could make it more likely? How can we make sure that this technology is going to lead us toward a world that we want to live in the future? And I think that one benefit that has for broadening the conversation is that you don't have to start with a sort of prerequisite of here are the things that you need to know about CRISPR before you can ask questions or participate in a conversation about how we might want to use it. You can come from the other side of it, which is where the public or specific publics have their expertise and from which they can draw on to really speak out in these conversations in a confident and engaged way.
Thanks. Samira, I want to reflect a little bit on the kind of choose your own adventure way that you allow folks to curate, right, what they're hearing. And curation is part of the issue. It's partly what questions we ask, but then how do we make sense of all the answers? You're allowing folks to kind of make sense of things in their own way. But what I'm curious is, how are you making sense of that as a scientist? Is what you're hearing feeding back into your own decisions? And if so, with what curated narrative in mind?
That's a very good question. I think that's something that we are trying to figure out too. As you know, these type of efforts are emerging. All of us ask the questions. And I sit in the panels and try to figure out, okay, enough with the questions. So what about the answer to the questions? And I'm struggling with those questions as well. We are hoping that by engaging a large enough public, we will be able to gather enough data from all these feedbacks, from all the likes, from all the usage of particular clips and the changes over, the attention to a particular clip over time. We will be able to understand what people think about a particular technology. Ben and I collaborate on this a lot. And we had a conversation about how we can take use of that. And then one question that came up was that exactly this question, how we are going to make use of all the feedback that we receive. But imagine that we have people putting two clips together like China and CRISPR babies and the Hong Kong summit, for a short period of time. And then after a while, we see the clips that are put together that are like China, CRISPR baby, and then the disease, or a patient who is like suffering from a disease purposes. So you start to understand that, okay, the perspective of the general public is now shifting towards they are becoming more and more curious about what are the implications of this technology. They're past from, all the debates of whether China did it right or not right. Or it's a very challenging task that I took up as a scientist, and I'm learning myself, but I'm curious and I'm motivated to put myself out there and be receiving all those, different positive and negative feedbacks. And not many scientists that are, I think, daring to actually open up to public like this. So.
Yeah, and I kind of put you on the spot by saying how will this influence what you do? But I think that's a question that I want to broaden for all of our panelists, and then we'll go to our audience both in the room and online. But this idea of the feedback mechanism of the work that you're each doing in different ways to engage broader voices, how does that feed back into decision making, whether it's at the scale of an individual scientist or lab, or the scientific institution more generally, however we define that, or other governing bodies? How are you actively, or not, I suppose, taking what you're hearing and then feeding it back in, and or if you're not doing it, is it because you're missing mechanisms to do that, or are there better ways to provide the channels to take your learnings and put them into decisions, or at least decision discussions? Sorry, that was a really big question, but you got the gist of it, right?
One of the ambitions of ARIGE is, of course, that our discussions, we're just new, we're just starting, but of course, one of our ambitions was how our discussions and our production, our literature production could be then passed on to policymakers at whatever level it be, national, European, regional, international. And so that is, it wasn't part of the 5 aims that we have, but one of the most important things that we would like to see happen is that what comes out of our different discussions, and they will be diverse and varied because we are having people from all over the world engage, is that this will be heard by policymakers. Now, obviously, it's not going to replace policymakers, but it will be a voice of an international nonprofit association addressing these ethical and social issues of genome editing in general. It's a hope.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Kelly or Katie, any thoughts or responses on that?
Sure. I think CGS does this in a number of ways. I mean, one of our main goals is building a network, building connections among the kinds of civil society organizations that I was talking about earlier, but also, scientists, social scientists, legal experts, and really bringing together these people doing great work in their different realms, bringing them together in the ways that their work overlaps with questions around genetic technologies. And then also playing a role in amplifying those voices, in communicating to the general public, in the academic literature, and also in doing some policy advocacy, really. Yeah.
I think our work is less about policy implications and more, from my perspective, about how we're educating providers of the future and scientists of the future. And so I feel like in my role at Stanford, in between the clinical departments and the basic departments I'm in, I'm trying to teach both groups a little bit about the other one and to get them to have more fruitful dialogues.
Great, thanks. And Samira, I had asked you about how it affects your decision making, but I'd be curious about your vision for how it affects decision making more broadly.
One very interesting experience that I had throughout the last 2 years making this movie was interacting with biohacking community, and then the idea that they have gained this much attention and followers from the people in the street really struck me really hard. Why is that? And then I realized that they sell themselves, us, in a scientific community, as they, and there's a mistrust against they in the general public. So the question for us would be, when we receive all these feedbacks, knowing that people do not trust the system, how do we want to actually divert those feedbacks into a really actionable items? The question that Ben always asks, who gets to decide? We always talk about policymakers and, but is this the ultimate answer? Are they, what should we do with all these feedbacks? Policymakers are good to target, but these are usually the organizations that general public usually do not trust. So how do we zoom out and really think about how we redirect all these feedbacks and become sort of entities that general public start to trust back again. Partly might be willing to open up and talking about our failures and be able to admit that we failed miserably with JK. I mean, and the way we reacted to his experiment. So I mean, these things are actually very important to consider.
As someone who is an engagement practitioner myself, I've learned very well that showing up and saying, I'm an engager and I'm here to help is not always the way that you get people to open up. Let's open up the questions here. Any folks in the audience here in the room? Okay, yep.
You just said how we made mistakes with JK and how we responded to him, and I'm just curious to understand what you mean. What the mistake was in response to his work.
So I believe that the fact that, and this is my personal opinion, and like having spent some time in China and interacting with people, I realized that the idea of actually what JK did was more complicated than just some rogue scientist doing something. And the fact that the general scientific community came back and actually reacted so harsh to JK's story can actually kind of damage some trust against communication about what is going on in other labs in future. And it can damage the way we interact with people from other cultures or other nations. So we have to be very creative in how we engage with these sort of missteps in scientific discoveries, so that people don't see us like fighting with each other first. And also we open a dialogue for people who make a mistake and just do something, so they feel a safe environment to come forward and confess. Right now, I'm not sure if we created that safe environment.
Great. Thanks. Kevin, do you have something from YouTube or online?
Yeah, so we have a poll everywhere question. And it says, Katie, awesome! Exclamation point. What approaches work best to engage with civil society sectors, and what have you learned?
Great. Well, thank you. And I would say that, one thing is to really be, coming to these groups with a sense of shared projects and political ideas, really looking at, what are the areas in which we overlap and how can we bring these conversations to the conversation about CRISPR, and actually to think about it as collaboration, right? Rather than a one way, like we're going to extract your position on this and take it somewhere else, but rather that, we are in a process of engagement and working together towards something. And we found that there has been also a very big appetite for these kinds of conversations among the public, right? The webinars that I presented both had hundreds of participants, and the event that we held last week on Berkeley campus with Bill McKibben, the environmental activist, and John Powell, who is a civil rights expert, had 500 people sign up, and we could only fit 200 in the room, and we filled it. So people are really eager to have these conversations, especially when they're tied to issues and political concerns that they're already engaged in and that they care about.
Thanks, Katie. Other questions? I see two in the back there, so we'll get both of you.
What the panel's thoughts were on where the White House is now with the request for information on synthetic biology issues, just the general RFIs from OSTP on synthetic bio issues, and also looking at machine learning. So if you're looking at CRISPR and automation, if that's a sufficient platform to engage the public, and if you think other similar technical interagency approaches are positive.
So you're just repeating the question. I think you're asking, so the one approach to outreach is through requests for information. You use the example of the White House to say, hey, tell us what you think, give us your input. it may align a little bit with the option we had on a prior slide around, public comment. So is that enough? I guess we can open it to anyone, but also broaden the framing, Jennifer, just beyond just the White House in the United States, but just governments in general.
Well, your question makes me think of what happened in the UK for mitochondrial transfer. And from everything that I've read, it was quite a success. There was a period where the UK where citizens were asked to interact with a platform and to give their opinion as to whether or not they were in favor of allowing that the HFEA allowed this particular technology to become legal. And the majority of the Brits said yes. And this particular interaction with the public was very important subsequently in allowing this technology to be voted on. It was, let us say, one area where the Brits voted yes on something that was good, and not the other one. But one criticism, however, of that procedure, which I also read and was attuned to, was expressed by Donna Dickinson, who's an eminent bioethicist and philosopher in Britain. And she said that the problem was with these kinds of exchanges is that they are limited within a very short space of time, and only people who already feel engaged or concerned about the issue will, or because they know somebody, will enter into contact with these platforms and give their opinions. So there are shortcomings. But I would think, if I look at all the different public engagement efforts that we've seen in Europe, that this was probably one of the best.
Thanks, Jennifer. Alta has a question back there, and then we'll see if there's any more online, Kevin.
So, looking across all of these various approaches, I find myself wondering if it's been possible to separate in these conversations what people think personally is right and wrong intrinsically versus what people think the government should make legal or illegal, because they're very different questions. And I'm not sure when I'm listening to you how much the conversation was one or the other or some kind of gamish of the two.
Right or wrong versus legal versus illegal. Kelly, I'm actually going to go to you because in talking to folks about their very subtle and nuanced opinions, as you highlighted, do you tease any of that out in terms of policy versus just kind of personal personal preferences?
In both of our interview studies, we actually did ask them how they felt about it for themselves versus how they felt about it sort of for others more broadly, which I think is about as close as we've gotten to asking what you're saying, Alta, about should this be legal, should this be available? And in general, I would say the responses we got were, I might have my own personal views, but I feel like people should have choices because lots of people have different views. And they didn't go further than that, unless they held a really strong, let's say, religious view that they didn't think this should be available at all and shouldn't be considered.
Thanks, Kelly. Anyone else want to respond to that question? Okay. Kevin, and we have just another minute or so, so anything else coming in from online?
Yeah, there's been a couple that capture a theme. And so kind of the theme revolves around the role of fiction, either maybe in a book or in a movie. And so one is kind of saying, if fiction can actually accurately explain the science, can it be instrumental in raising awareness? But then someone else kind of flipped that and said, well, Jurassic Park is how many people think about genetic engineering. So besides the movies, who's influencing the public opinion in a big way? Actually, at the IGI, we had some bioartists come yesterday, and what they have been doing in Germany is bringing Instagram influencers to their place and saying, like, look what we're doing, go influence, and yeah, so.
Yeah, it's a great question, a great segue to our next discussion too, where I was hoping to bring this up further, but just the role of narrative, right? We rely on storytelling in a way to try to make sense of all this information, but it goes back to curation too, that stories shape the way we think, and there may be alternative stories out there. So when we see something like Jurassic Park or we hear Brave New World, and we kind of organically and we intuitively kind of start internalizing that story as a way of making sense of all this, what does that mean for engagement that seeks to go beyond the shortcuts in thinking? Is it a helpful entry point, or is it a distraction, or what's your experience?
It's helpful.
Okay.
Obviously very helpful. Although, I mean, it's an entryway, and we have to be careful to supplement it with enough information for the public or whoever is interested in, so that they can absorb the right amount of information and not be caught into tiny little details that are not that much important.
Thanks. Any other responses? It looks like a couple. We'll take those, yeah.
Oh,
Kelly?
I was going to say, I think it's really helpful as well, but I think we also need to stress the narratives that are about what life is like with these different conditions, which really goes to your point, Katie, before about what kind of society do we want to live in? And if we're making decisions ignorant of all of the different varieties of what life can be like, then we're making biased decisions.
Yeah. I think a similar point, I mean, we can think about the fictional narratives that are out there that sort of encapsulate what people hope for, what they fear, what they see could develop. But we've also heard earlier about the kinds of narratives around hype that really can raise false hopes and expectations in irresponsible ways and shape the conversation that way. And so I think that we should look at narratives, but also we should engage them critically.
I was struck when the series Unnatural Selection just came out on Netflix. I was watching it in France, and it came out on French Netflix as well. And then as I was reading on Twitter different reactions to this series that came out, what struck me was that the scientists were really criticizing the series for being inaccurate on so many levels, and then lay people, or like me, or some of my students who I suggested to them to watch, were saying, "Oh wow, this is really well done," and "Oh my God, this is great." And it just struck me that there already was this difference between the specialists and the non-specialist with regards to a series which was meant to educate, I think, and or to create an entry point for lay people. And already there was this separation between these two groups, and that really, really struck me.
Thank you. We'll continue the discussion of storylines and how stories are used and how we employ them in different mechanisms of engagement in just a minute or two here. I want to thank our panelists for this first part of session 3. So thank you so much. All right, so we're going to dive into this next piece. Again, we took some liberties in loosely categorizing the different parts of this session. So we're turning now to a group of folks who do a lot in terms of looking at engagement techniques, or in bringing in different voices to these conversations. They just are sitting from a vantage point of maybe not exclusively looking at germline and genetics. Maybe they're working on a lot of different issues and have some lessons to bring in from those other issues as well. So that's the general framing of this session, is to hear about these different mechanisms being employed, whether it's citizen dialogue or film or Twitter analysis. Our panelists are Henrietta Hopkins at Hopkins Van Mill, Simon Burrell from Involve, Michael Flaherty with Epiphany Story Lab and previously Walden Media, Sonia Pemberton with Gene Pool Productions, and Guillaume Louvrier with Sciences Po. And again, bios are all available online, and we're going to dive right in just like we did before, starting with Henrietta.
Okay, thanks. Well, thank you so much for asking me. I'm really thrilled to be in amongst you all. I take Ben's irony from earlier, yes, but it's still a wonderful gathering. So Hopkins Van Mill specialise in dialogue and deliberation to allow people to reflect and have meaningful engagement on issues which are challenging, technologically or emotionally, and almost always for things that society just don't have answers for yet. That doesn't mean the deliberation we work on creates the answers. It perhaps creates more questions than answers, but it gives people a space for that meaningful engagement. So we create spaces in which people's stories, their ideas, and their views really matter. And they know at the end of the process that their views have mattered. And we do that by engaging them with scientists, with ethicists, with people who have a stake in the issue, with people, as indeed do the publics that are engaged in them. And those people who shape and make policy. I'm going to focus on a program, as I was asked to, that we ran for the Royal Society in the UK. And it's a program that's been mentioned a number of times this morning, but not this bit of it. So this was about a public dialogue. And a lot of the things I'm saying resonate with what we've just heard, in fact. But as Julie's just said, we engage on a load of things, from publics with environment and climate change, through health and big data in itself, and most recently with the Royal Society, again, on a program of neural interfaces, which is, for many people, completely new and cutting edge horizon kind of technologies. So I just thought I'd quickly say something about public dialogue. And I want to change that sort of immediately to citizens dialogue, because public dialogue has been the phrase, but I completely chime with everything Katie said about public. And so citizens or publics is much more comfortable. But public dialogue takes the form of a series of workshops over time. And time is one of those differentiators of the dialogue process. It allows people to think, to talk to their friends and family in between talking to us, to look at evidence in a whole variety of thought forms. And we've worked with theatre companies to provide the evidence. We've worked, informed, of course, by the science. We work with scientists in the room, with ethicists in the room, all of whom can inform the discussion in a wide range of ways. But the public are the publics, the diverse people in the room, are bringing their common sense and their lived experience to the process, which makes it incredibly meaningful. But having a balance of perspectives in the room is what we do. So for this program on the screen, if I move the slides on, what you can see is what we did. So we recruited a broad demographic of the public. So these are people who are recruited. They're not self-selecting. We held workshops in 3 locations on genetic technologies, one on plants, one on humans, and one on animals. So it was a range of genetic technologies, not just human and not just germline. It was a 2-round deliberative process. So people met once, they had a space, and then they came back and met us again, and we talked with them again. But it was a 2-way exchange where they are creating they're making their views heard. It was supported by a survey, a nationally representative survey, and we also came back again several months later to talk specifically to the people who've been thinking about human applications, about where to draw the line with human genome editing. So I just want to pick up a couple of things. So there's a big report online. It's on the Royal Society website. But I really want to just pick up some sort of quotes, really, that people want to understand the risk, particularly with germline applications. So something may have fatality attached to it. If we can eradicate a condition that will kill someone early, then I find that more compelling than other things. Balanced with clarity. We need clarity on these issues. We have to be very, very cautious, is what people were saying. And part of that caution was monitoring over time to see what the effects could be. But we also noticed a change in attitude as people progressed through the dialogue, from people who had no knowledge at all of the subject to becoming curiously fascinated and going away and doing masses of their own research about the subject, from absolute fear of a dystopian future to a cautious optimism, from skepticism about the process as just a tick box exercise to this means my voice has been heard. And so people really valued their engagement and their time for reflection and taking part in something enormously enjoyable. Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So the good news for you is I'm basically going to say exactly the same thing that Katie said earlier, but just in slightly different words. So you've got 5 minutes to fall asleep, catch your breath, and then you'll all be all right. So I'm not going to answer. I was asked to talk about processes, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk about 2 gaps in public engagement that I think there are at the moment, existing practice. I'm going to identify one misconception that scientists and policymakers have about the public, and then make 2 proposals for how we fill the gaps. So that's what I'm intending to do in my 5 minutes, not very much. So So this is an example of one of the sorts of processes that Henrietta was talking about. There have been over 50 of these processes around science technology sponsored by a government program called ScienceWise across a whole range of issues. And many of them can be profoundly, have a profound impact on very specific policy questions. In fact, indeed, Jenny, the mitochondrial transfer included one of these. So it didn't just include people who wanted to be part of the process. It also recruited a sample of the British public that's reflective of the wider population. But we're hearing that there are kind of twin concerns in this room. One is, how do we have an impact on policy? And the second concern is, how do we influence the wider debate? And the problem is, particularly in the UK, this is the dominant form of process. But if we want these people to have an effect on the rest of the debate, when we kind of send them back into society, they get just diluted back down. And I call it the homeopathy theory of public engagement. We dilute them so much that how do we think they're going to have an impact on the debate? And of course they can't. So this is the first gap, that we have a gap in terms of how we actually influence the debate. And I think a number of the things we're going to hear about in terms of films, in terms of innovative ways of engagement, are going to be very good in terms of influence the debate. The key gap is, how do we then connect that back into policy making? And so we can affect the big debate through big films and big catchy stuff, or we can influence the policy through smaller engagement. But there's a gap between how do we connect this lot to the policy decisions. So the second gap I think there is when we bring the public into the room, when we kind of recruit this sample that's reflective of the wider population, policymakers and scientists appear to assume that the public is this amorphous blob that doesn't have views until they're brought into the room. But of course, the public is talking about these questions in their daily lives, down the pub, in their mother and toddler groups, because somebody's got a child who's ill. They're talking about it across a range of issues, but they're not being listened to. They're not being heard. But that's not where the policymakers and scientists are. So the second gap is, how do we get policymakers and scientists actually to meet real people in the wild, as it were? So my first proposal, which I'd been calling an observatory, but now that Ben and Sheila have grabbed that term, I'm going to call it something different. But the first proposal is, we need to start listening to the public where they are. So we need to start going to where they are. We need to start engaging. So we need to form some sort of office for public debate. And the role of the Office for Public Debate is going to be to do a number of different things, if I can call my notes back up. So it's going to need to connect the public to the scientific debates. There are going to be misconceptions in the way the public's talking about these things. So how do we better inform them? We need to be connecting the public to experts. The experts have got multiple misconceptions about what the public think. They often think the public is stupid, and the public really aren't stupid. They often think the public is just going to reject this technology out of hand. All of our work shows the public don't reject these technologies out of hand. There's lots of contingents, yes, but, and it's in the but where all the interesting stuff happens. And finally, with this Office for National Debate, Office for Public Debate, is going to have to actually engage as an active protagonist. So it can't just listen, it's going to have to actually engage actively. So my misconception, which Katie has already talked about, is when policymakers think about engagement, they think about either engaging the public, this amorphous blob that if we just know what they think, that we can go and act on it, which is clearly wrong, but I can't expand that in 5 minutes. Or they think about engaging stakeholders, and these stakeholders are groups that have already identified they've got an interest and are engaging. There's a group in the middle, which is civil society, as Katie highlighted, and of course all of these groups are part of the public in different ways. And so my final proposal is, we need to start thinking about how we create networks. How do we actually kind of tap into networks that exist already within civil society, and how do we kind of expand and reconnect them? So we're going to be piloting early next year something we're calling distributed dialogue, where we're going to be training community facilitators to go out into the community to engage with community groups, not on gene editing, on issues to do with data and data science, but it's a similar sort of question that's going to affect us all widely. So how do we begin to kind of connect the networks together and connect those networks back into decision making? So that's what we're going to be doing. Thanks.
Again, I just want to thank everybody for putting all this together. And I think the key to all this is the Templeton Foundation is great, because they recognize what the Clapham Circle, who were the abolitionists of their time in Great Britain, realized, which is you have to get all kinds of voices in the room. You need the animals from Edinburgh, you need the plants from other places, and then you need us phony filmmakers from Hollywood. But more important, what you need to do is you have to understand the intersection of all these things, of stories, of politics, and technology. So we'll go through about 5,000 years in 5 minutes. But if we could go to the next slide, I promised that I would begin with I'm in control. Wow. First, a word from our sponsor, PG&E. And we want to thank them. My son and I actually had a running bet. I told him CRISPR was the greatest technology ever invented. He said it was electricity. I called him yesterday and told him what happened, and he said, "You owe me $5." But Thomas Edison was so bullish on electricity, he said that in 10 years, textbooks will be as obsolete as the horse and buggy. That was 1922. We are starting to see how screen time is replacing textbooks. But what that also shows you is that entrepreneurs greatly outpace the rest of us in terms of the impact that their invention will have. Still in control. If we go back to Socrates, I want to talk a lot about consensus because I think that we have this idea that it's organic and that it's something that reaches its natural level and it's something that we should obey. We should remind ourselves that about the Dred Scott decision that was decided 7-2, that Africans were property of American people. And we should be reminded about Socrates, who was killed, not by the government, but by the people. The mob will always choose Barabbas. So if we're looking to influence a majority of people, it's a fool's errand. But Socrates, as far back as you go, he had this crazy new technology called writing. And like he is, and according to everybody, he was an incorrigible ass. You'd never want to be cornered by this guy. He would bore you to tears. And he said that writing would create forgetfulness in the learner's souls, and that it would lead to nothing, and that readers would be tiresome company, having the show of wisdom without the reality. And oh no, that was I had a big reveal there. Hold on one second. How do I go backwards? Okay, thank you. So in terms of the different ways we can get consensus, one is it can be manipulated and manufactured. How many people have heard of Thomas Dixon? Thomas Dixon wrote books, but he realized that books were being replaced by the motion picture. Close to 80% of the American public was going to see films every year. So he got the best director of the day, D.W. Griffith, to make a film about his book. And he then got his buddy from Johns Hopkins to host the first White House screening in the history of Hollywood. That first White House screening was The Birth of a Nation, a movie that celebrated the Ku Klux Klan as heroes. At the time of this film's release, there were fewer than 100 people in the Klan. 6 years later, there were over 100,000 people in the Ku Klux Klan. That's the impact that film can have. That's how much it can influence people. New entertainment platforms and the press have this very uneasy relationship because they compete for consensus and they compete for advertising dollars. How many people remember the story of H.G. Wells reading War of the Worlds on Halloween? Orson Welles, of course. He was only 22-year-old. Was H.G. Wells wrote it, though, so we got to give him some credit. Orson Welles stole it, like all us other phony producers. And he recreated it, and he had 4 separate warnings during the broadcast. This is a fake broadcast. And the newspapers wasted absolutely no time. The next morning, Howard Koch, who had written it for Orson, saw on the cover of the Examiner, "Radio Fake Scares Nation." The New York Times, "Radio listeners in panic, taking war drama as fact." And for all of you people that are on the edge of innovation, you'd like to know that 2 days later, the New York Times editorialized that radio was a technology that was in its infancy, and it should sit back and learn lessons from the adults before it learned to go too quickly. So that's something that will always happen. And finally, if you look to the government, they like to create consensus through entertainment. Hitler, we all know, is somebody that did that very effectively through the Olympics and Leni Riefenstahl's films. But the U.S. government also did it with the Walt Disney Company. And they made all kinds of cartoons to draw attention to the dangers in Germany. And finally, Winston Churchill himself said the movie Mrs. Miniver was worth more than a flotilla of battleships. Finally, I do believe good stories make good societies. And I think it is important that we do establish a consensus, but I think it will be through our moral imagination, as Ben said. I know I'm over time, but I'll just close with a film we made based on one of my favorite books called The Giver. And unlike a lot of the books that are dystopias, this was a supposed utopia where nobody could feel any pain and there was no war. But as a result, there was no pleasure because some of those scars and some of the pain, those things define us and they make life more valuable. And we have Meryl Streep over there on the left saying when people have the freedom to choose, they choose wrong. That's what happens when you surrender your decision-making to the government. And then this one hero says they haven't eliminated murder, they just call it by a different name because they look at babies that have deficient genomes and they give them release parties. It's something that's celebrated in the culture, and release is just a euphemism for infanticide. So, Ben, I congratulate you and I thank you, and I think it's important to create this consensus and to bring as many people to the table as possible. Thanks.
Hello. I'm Sonia Pemberton. Following on from this, I'm a filmmaker as well. I make documentary films. I'm a writer, director, and producer, and I lead a company called Gene Pool Productions. We're an Australian-based production company, and that's me in the far left over there. We like to make films about science. I have a passion for science. I come from a background of science. My whole family are scientists. I come from a medical background. I originally studied medicine, but I got very interested in how we could use the film medium to turn stories of science into something people want to watch. So we've made lots of films about complex subjects. Uranium, 1 hours on uranium on PBS, if anybody remembers Twisting the Dragon's Tail. We turned it into Flying Dragons. Interesting, but it worked. Highest downloaded, illegally downloaded series in PBS's history. Yes! We've made films about vaccines, 2 films about vaccines on Nova and around the world. And recently, of all things, vitamins, Vitamania, again, contentious in its own way because the science is somewhat contested. Our films reach between about 10 and 20 million people worldwide, and they win lots of awards. We've won about 70 awards. And the reason that I bring that up is because you can make really good science films and you can get people to watch and you can be recognized by the scientists and the public. Last year, I flew myself to Hong Kong just to sit in the room because I thought it sounded like an interesting conference. Little did I know I'd be sitting right at the moment when the CRISPR babies were announced, and I was about 4 meters away from the whole thing and watched it. And it was an extraordinary couple of days, as the people who were there know. What really struck me, though, was day 4. All the media went home. And day 4 was the day of public engagement. At that point, I went, there is a serious problem here. Something's going wrong. There's 200-odd media here the day before for the sensationalism, and there's me and 1 other journalist the next day. So there's a great deal of talk about public engagement, but really how? To what end? There are lots of films out there, and there's a growing number of films out there. As we've talked about unnatural selection, there's human nature, there's the genome revolution. There's quite a lot of good films out there, and they all do different jobs in different ways. There's lots of community events, regional events, all these sorts of things we've heard about today. And there's lots and lots and lots and lots of scientists meeting behind closed doors. But I kept thinking, how can we help as Gene Pool? What can we do? What is a useful thing here? How can I amplify something useful in the world? And critically, how can I help in some way to give people a voice in what I think is one of the biggest issues of our time? A rather controversial word and a rather controversial picture. Mutant is a 3 by 1 hour documentary series and an unprecedented international social experiment. Is it the end game? No, but it's part of the game of public engagement. It's about how citizens of the world might weigh in on one of the most consequential issues of our time. For the first time, we want to bring citizens of the world together to have their say in deciding what futures should or should not be brought into being. We're inviting people from Africa, Australia, Brazil, China, France, North America, and beyond to come together for an extraordinary event, the very first global citizens' jury, or using other terminology, a citizens' dialogue or a citizens' assembly. We've chosen jury because we're television makers and it's a little bit edgier. They represent many different ages, cultures, religions, all sorts of diverse people with all sorts of abilities and all sorts of sensibilities. They come together for 5 days to interrogate the science, the scientists, the applications, and really importantly, to explore their hopes and their dreams and their fears and their worries around this technology. What are their questions around this technology? And ultimately, to deliberate on what they want to do next. Importantly, we're going to do plants, animals, and humans. Our global audience will see what the audience and the jury see, and they'll undergo basically 6 ethical dilemmas, and each story will build in complexity. If anybody here watches Gogglebox, it's basically a way of watching people watching television, and it's become a huge hit all around the world. We're going to watch people debating the watching of the issues around the science. And then we amplify that via streaming and via television broadcasts all over the world, and we have many partners attached. Ultimately, on the final day, we try and find out if people from all these different backgrounds can somehow exit the echo chambers of their own beliefs and come to some sort of recommendations about what they feel should happen next. And here's the thing, we want to make the stakes real. We want to actually have the change makers, the United Nations, World Health Organization, and so forth in the room listening to what the people have to say. And will they heed what's going on? So it's a new conversation between science and society, and technically it's a landmark in democracy. We've brought together an international consortium of experts led by the Centre of Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance in Australia, together with a whole lot of global experts. We have 9 countries, I think, involved so far. We've got a full proposal, and we've got a treatment, and we've got a whole description on how we're actually going to do this. It's available if anybody wants to have a look at it. The documentary series is completely funded, so we don't need any money for that, but we're actually looking for money to fund the global citizen jury. So if you're interested, please come talk to us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Guillaume Levrier. I'm a political scientist from University Sciences Po in Paris, and I'm working on the policy and institutional issues raised by genome editing. In other words, I'm trying to look how different societies that use different mechanisms to allocate power, wealth, opportunities will have to cope with a capacity to precisely intervene on the genome of different organisms. Now, some part of this study is quite straightforward. I can just interview the politicians that are interested in those questions, interview the scientists and the stakeholders that they consult, and have a pretty good idea of how they will translate technical issues into policy issues they can deal with. However, doing that, the picture wouldn't be complete. There's a wider debate on that. And as you know, the CRISPR germline editing debate is social media native. By that, I mean that in 2015, since we've been doing this CRISPR germline editing, Twitter and Facebook, for example, had been around for a long time as a means for individuals to share their opinions, to debate their arguments, and to push for their platforms. So what we're going to have a look today is how germline editing has been debated on Twitter after the news of the birth of Lulu and Nana in China. So before speaking further, I want to emphasize that this is still a work in progress, and that the conclusion it yields might be different from what you get today. So in order to have an idea of what kind of opinions, of reactions people would have to the news of the birth of the CRISPR babies, the CRISPR twins, I collected through the Twitter API tweets mentioning a series of keywords such as CRISPR, CRISPR babies, Hejiankui, etc. over 6 months. And this query yielded 1 million tweets, a bit less than 1 million tweets. So this is what it looks like. I won't go into detail. Every circle is a tweet. Right there, I have only the first 3 days from the 26th to the 29th of November. Basically, here what I want to say, because I can't take the time to describe everything precisely, is that the metadata you get from the Twitter API is not enough to get which tweets are giving an actual qualification or an actual opinion of what's going on. Not the replies, not the amount of retweets, not the amount of followers. This doesn't help you. And if you do it by hand, well, you'll see that much less than 1% of the tweets actually give an opinion of what's going on. And you can't do it by hand because there's a million of those tweets. So how do you classify such a big amount of tweets in order to have those who give an actual opinion? When one of the options is using machine learning, the algorithms prepared by Explosion AI, namely Prodigy and Spacey, that let you train a model. And by that, you can include some of the tweets taking a subset of this huge data set, including those of the tweets that give an actual opinion and excluding those who don't. So basically, what we're looking for here is some kind of qualification of the events that happened in China and see what they say. So this is an example. This is an example of 4 of the 13 categories I'm working on right now. So some would say this is about bioethics in China. This is about one scientist that has been reckless. This is about technical issues. This is about something else. So this is just examples. You can't really read the tweets there, but yeah, basically it doesn't really matter. What you really need to understand is that we're not quite interested in the content of the tweets themselves, but we're interested in the patterns of debate in which such arguments will occur. Is it just a reaction to the news? I've seen this article, I'm sharing the article and giving an adjective or a sentence. Or is it in a broader debate, a thread, and can we situate patterns of threads on Twitter? So this is an example of threads. It's not part of the aforementioned data set. It's much more recent. It's a reaction to the web page that has been published by the National Academy of Science on germline editing. If you're following, well, you can't really read either, but basically there are 3 arguments here. One is the PGD plus argument. Germline editing is just PGD, but you're adding an editing step to create viable embryos that don't have the pathogenic trait. The future person argument, is it the person to be born, la personne potentielle in French? And do we have to take account for the welfare of this future person that might be either an embryo or maybe 2 gametes and a compound of a nuclease and a guide? And the third debate is who should allocate this capacity? Is it for the state to reduce inequality, or is it for anyone that can afford it? So that's the big question. So as a temporary conclusion, I would say that what we see right now for this debate on Twitter is that most of the arguments are not really linked to germline editing itself. They're more linked to, like the technical debates are really linked to what happened with IVF. The eugenics debates is really similar to the debates we had 30 years ago with PGD. And the debate that we're not having is how do we have the technology of government, how do we have the institutional design to create a system that can earn the trust of the individuals to have a good management of this ever-evolving power yielded by nucleases. Thank you for attention.
I have a lot of questions, and I kind of want to dive into them all at the same time, and I also want to leave time for everyone else. So just slow myself down here a little bit and start with one. Henriette, I'm going to start with you. You discussed a bit the process you used with the Royal Society. And how that process, you've used it in other contexts, other technologies, other issues. What I'm curious about is there something unique, though, to the germline editing conversation that would beg a different process or a different kind of dialogue? And what would that look like?
Yeah, I think apologies for the gabbling through the process. That probably wasn't very effective. But what I think was unique about this is, as often, is the way you present the evidence. So I think Katie again, sorry, Katie, but talking about the history of genome editing more broadly, talking about genetic technologies in the round. So we introduced the subject with early humans and their way of breeding dogs to get the ones that could hunt well, the ones that would be more domestic, and we end up with a dog that we have today in our homes. So we contextualized it, and I think the evidence you present is always unique. So these dialogues, you may be using similar processes, but the design of them is always very unique to that subject, and the kind of activities we do with people. So we had Simon's great pictures of it, but they're people standing up, aren't they? They're people interacting in all sorts of ways. And one of the things I wanted to pick up earlier that someone said, it's only the loud voices that are heard. In this kind of process, actually, the kind of range of tailored activities you would do around perhaps germline editing or perhaps some other form of genome editing, but that would enable all voices to be heard, not the loud voices, and the very effect of them being facilitated by people who have rooted themselves in the subject helps enormously in getting a balance of views. But I think every dialogue has its unique process, which is again very hard to describe in this small space. But
we're not giving you a lot of time to do that. But Simon, do you want to build on that at all, just in terms of, in general, the engagement mechanisms you use? Is there something unique or that needs to be adapted when you're talking specifically about germline editing?
I mean, so each process is different and unique, as Henrietta said. But in terms of kind of the science, which I think is what you're asking about.
I'm not sure what I'm asking about. I'm just asking.
So at the moment, the program. The program I mentioned, ScienceWise, has done dialogues over the last 15 years on nuclear technologies, on synthetic biology, nanotechnology, and all of these things have got their own sets of challenges around describing the science, around how the nature of the conflict around the science, and each of them requires its own kind of bespoke process. But in the end, I don't think that genome editing, whether germline or more broadly, is that different. And I think the critical thing is, and I'm kind of seeing it replicated a bit in this room, is that the debates centre around scientific risk. And in this particular context, they're centering around the risks of off-target mutations and so on. But what they miss is that wider conversation the public want to have about potential wider benefits and potential wider social harms. We heard a little bit of it this morning from Keolu and others in terms of indigenous groups. But the conversation isn't just about the science and the medical benefits. It's also about who owns this science, who benefits from this science, who chooses what is and is not in the public benefit, who defines what public benefit is in the first place. Because this technology and a small range of others are going to totally change our lives. They're going to change what we think it means to be human. They're going to change they're not just going to change the medicine we get, but the way we receive medicine. They'll totally change our medical processes, but they're also going to change the materials that we use, the crops we eat, and so on. And so this is a fundamentally important question that needs to use the sorts of processes that Henrietta's been describing and we do a lot of, and needs to be a whole society engagement process.
Thanks. Both of your responses touched a little bit on this issue of the framing of the questions, which questions we put forward in the first place, and it ties back to the conversation we were having in the first part here around even just curation, right, of the storyline. So I want to turn to both Sonia and Michael. Michael, you kind of gave the really alarming view of how film can be used in a very, agenda-driven, manipulative way. I suppose it's not for us to argue that about at this time what the responsibility is of which arguments you present. But let's just say you want to go forward as a filmmaker, as Sonia, I think you described your intent to do, and do something kind of responsibly. I don't think you use that term, but I think that's what you're getting at. How do you contribute in a way that's meaningful? So what's that balance? How do filmmakers really who want to kind of responsibly put forward a tough issue and then simultaneously tell a entertaining storyline, do it? How do you accomplish that? Either one of you.
Yeah, I'm impressed that you got your documentary funded, because I think that our colleague from France was the perfect person to end this on, because when he showed that slide, people have their prejudices, China's crazy. Look what they're doing with babies. We must advance the science as forward as possible. And so they're taking these things and they're fitting them into their worldview. And it's like Chesterton's said, we fool ourselves into thinking that we're being skeptical and intelligent. We're really just being dogmatic.
It's just confirmation bias.
And exactly. And the true danger for us as filmmakers is we have it all backwards. There's a company that was started here called Netflix. It's one of the biggest entertainment companies in the world right now. And when you go in to present something, they brag about their algorithm and they point to your slide and they say, these are the 4 types of films we're looking for when it has to do with genetics. And the co-founder of Netflix had two uncles. One was Sigmund Freud and the other was Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays' job was to convince women that cigarettes were liberty torches and that they should smoke as an expression of freedom. And so there's a direct line there between influencing human behavior, and there's direct evidence that a documentary they had influenced the election in Brazil. And so I think that, and this morning, again, the presentation I thought was fantastic on Indigenous folks, it's just really important to let people know when they're being manipulated and how they're being manipulated to give them a good defense.
So how do you bring that bias forward? How do you make it transparent in your own filmmaking?
I was going to say, I've spent 20 years making science films, and I work with Dan Kahan, Professor Dan Kahan at Yale, and others who study the science of science communication. And I've spent the last 7 years actively working with him and others going, how do you get messages across that are useful? Now, how you define useful, of course, we could have a half-hour conversation, but let's assume that's just understanding of the mechanics of how something works as a starting point. How you deal with bias is absolutely the focus of all of our films. The last 7 or 8, 9 films have all been about confronting biases, whether your own, as my own as a filmmaker, and my team, and the bias of the people in the audience. So we have a lot of techniques we've developed. Friends and people, colleagues I work with at Tangle Bank Studios and HHMI, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and Vulcan and people like that, you know, they always ask, what's the difference between what you're doing and advertising? Because really advertising is manipulation, you know, let's be straight about it. And it's a tough one to find that line, but basically the motivation is different. The motivation is to impart knowledge as best as we can given this moment in time. And I come from a long heritage of medical investigators and medical scientists and doctors, and they have brought me up to know that things change. My grandfather at 96, you know, had an article published in the BMJ. I think he's the oldest sole authored paper in the British Medical Journal at 96. And he said, you know, basically 50% of what he learned at university has been disproven in the time since. My father is now 75, and he says at least a third of what he was taught at medical school has now changed. So I've been brought up with that kind of appreciation that things change. So every film has to be within that caveat that this is the best information we have right now. This is me offering it to you in a way that has factual evidence behind it and has a lot of data. We had 5 fact checkers for 2 years on the most recent film. 5 for 2 whole years. That's on vitamins. I mean, I've got to tell you, that was the hardest one. It's harder than uranium. Do you know it's harder to get into a vitamin factory than a nuclear power plant? But anyway, so really, it doesn't sound contentious, but trust me, it's contentious.
How big an industry is it? How much money?
Oh gosh, you will ask me that now. It's many billions. I forget how many. And also it was going up between 2018 and 2020. It was doubling.
So there's a connection.
That'll be our next symposium. The vitamin industry.
But the point being that, you know, how to find a way to communicate the science in a way that is effective and factually accurate, but also gets an audience. That is the $1 million question. That is why we get funded to a high level and why we spend years and years and years making projects. And I've got to say one more thing, because I was so impressed by what you were doing with Twitter. The deliberative forums that we're talking about is the antithesis to the Twitter reaction. The Twitter reaction is really important in the sense that it gives you a snapshot of what the world's thinking at any given moment. But when you give people 5 days to sit down and think and consider, as I've been told by the people we're working with, about 60% of people change their opinion over those 5 days. And I think that's really interesting. You can shift opinion.
Let's talk more about Twitter. Okay, quick, and then I want to get Guillaume.
I'm more worried about the corollary. That's something that someone might say offhanded on Twitter, that they'll be judged by that for the rest of their life.
Yes, I agree.
So let's talk about Twitter for a second, because people love Twitter. People love to talk about how Twitter, especially as an example of social media, just drives polarization. But I'm curious, Guillaume, in your analysis, at least your preliminary analysis, are you seeing is the stereotype of it's just a polarized conversation holding true, or is there something else going on in there?
So it depends on the ripples, actually. It's true that you have numerous examples, especially when the news just goes off and then it's a one shot, sharing articles, for example, BBC articles saying this is atrocious, or this is the future, or just like a very short sentence or just an adjective. But as I tried to show in my last slide as well, there are threads of actual discussion about what this is about. And what are we talking about? Is it PGD? Is it China? Is it something else? Is it a conspiracy theory? Is it some, yeah. So it's true that probably in absolute value, in a quantitative way, most of the reactions might be, like you said, very polar, very extreme. But you also have examples of actual debates and actual arguments being given on each side. And what struck me in this analysis is that the arguments are not really specific to germline editing. You can find the same arguments 40 years ago with IVF, and you can find the same arguments about PGD as well. Should we do it? Should we screen the babies? Is it eugenics? And so, yeah, today what strikes me most about the debate on Twitter is that it's not specifically on germline editing.
Is it tribal?
I'm not sure, well, what does tribal mean in this specific context, you know? On Twitter, we don't really have the data on this. We would need to have precise data on who owns the accounts, where do they live, do we have ways to check the actual factual data behind that? We don't, so I can't say whether it's really tribal or not.
So a lot of these conversations, or your presentations in this conversation, have kind of swirled around two themes, and I'm just going to jam them all into one question and see what you want to do with them. But we've kind of talked about the tension of more targeted engagement of the kind that Henrietta described versus the need for breadth, right? Simon, you highlighted that. We've also kind of alluded to what we often talk about as the education deficit model, if we just need to put information out there, versus the kind of feedback two-way engagement model. But interestingly, the nuance, I think, is we're hearing education is a really important step towards effective engagement. But again, that circles back to this idea of how can you do that on scale to actually really understand what we're thinking societally, even nationally, let alone globally, right, as Ben was talking about. So to kind of throw that out to anyone, again, it's a super big question, but how do we balance the need for education with that need for engagement? How do we balance this idea of breadth versus depth? And then I'll turn to the audience, yeah. Anyone can jump in.
I'll just very quickly, the average teenager's about 70 hours of screen time, and they're spending probably 30 hours in the school. So any influence is going to come through social media and YouTube. And I think that for anyone here, don't let facts get in the way. Like Tolkien said, every good story deserves exaggeration. I'll leave here remembering the story of the kid with sickle cell, and I've never even seen the movie, saying, I don't know if I wouldn't want my child to have sickle cell because it's defined who I am. And so those specifics, I think, really get to the heart of these multiple ethical dilemmas.
So stories help create the stickiness, kind of, and the breadth.
Yeah, don't bog people down with the facts.
Okay. I'd love to hear the broader debate on that. Simon, go ahead, jump in.
So as Guillaume said, we've been having these debates going all the way back, way beyond kind of when we've been talking about genetic technologies. And so I think one of the problems we have is that policymakers and scientists invent a new thing, and they, oh my God, we've got to engage the public. But we keep going round these debates, round and round these debates. So if we're going to solve the breadth problem by having an ongoing, sustainable conversation with the public. And it's through those smaller interactions with smaller bits of time, which if we can build up a shared understanding, both within those who currently hold power, but also within the public, and you're building up capacity over a longer period of time. Let's think on the kind of timescales of 20, 30, 40, 50 years, rather than trying to solve the problem in the next 18 months, before the next CRISPR application comes out, because we're on a hiding to nothing if we do that. So I think strategically.
Fascinating. I know Sonia and Guillaume want to jump in. Let's take your quick thoughts.
I want to say that I don't think it's either or. I think what we have to do is all of the above. We need artists doing paintings about CRISPR. We need theatrical films. We need discussions. We need people doing blogs. We need Twitter. We need all of it. And I think the second we get into our bunkers and think that there's this delineation between public engagement, we all are here because we want the public to think about these issues. And really, who cares what your methodology is? As long as you're motivation of what you're trying to do is solid, and that is, let's get this subject out there and talked about. When we're looking at the show that's on Netflix at the moment, I've watched the whole show. Everyone in this room should watch it. It's 4 hours long, and it's polarizing people. The wave, we predicted that the polarization wave, I say we, but this is also with Dan Kahan at Yale, has predicted that it's about 2 years away. That's just sped it up by about 12 months, right? So people are frightened. You're seeing people are frightened. You're seeing the scientists are cross because this bit's wrong, that bit's wrong, this bit's all right. Underneath it all is a tapping into fear, and that's a very powerful thing to tap into. Watch any news program, read any newspaper. Fear sells more than love or intelligence or bonding, or this is the way we work. So I think we have to do everything in our power to get public messages out there.
Thanks, Sonia. I had promised Guillaume a word, and then I want to go to some questions. So if we
so
can keep it
maybe
short.
two things. First, you don't need consensus to create laws. And the last law on bioethics in France just showed that there is no consensus. And well, there has been a big change. And second, you don't need public debate when you have 5-year plans. So maybe the idea that public debate is needed on a global scale and on every territory on Earth is not something we should take for granted. And some countries might sovereignly decide to move on without a public debate because that's how they function. So it's also something we have to take into account.
Thanks. Who's got a question? Yes, in the back there. And then we'll come up to Samira. Can you take the microphone, please? Thanks.
Wonderful talks and broad. As an anthropologist, I feel like an important dimension that's missing is not overt advertising, but the cultural press and economic press and social press and political press foreseeing certain things as desirable, necessary, positive, and beneficial. And how difficult it is, for example, culturally to not use, and not develop these kinds of technologies. And I think if you have more awareness of what is determining people's individual opinions, the public's opinions, professional opinions, and a broader sense of those forces that go on and will be affecting every single, technology as they develop.
Thanks. So you're really speaking to the counterfactuals, right? What are we talking about, the risks of using something versus the risks of not using it? Do you want to respond to that in terms of how you do engagement? Or what's that? What influences that?
Well, I like what there's, in terms of government, those are ever-shifting sands. So the Warner Brothers were almost jailed for making anti-Nazi films because Germany was the world's second largest film market. The government then went to the Warner Brothers and said, could you please make anti-Nazi films for us? And then after that, Howard Koch, who wrote one of their films, gets put on the red list and gets blackballed for being a so-called communist sympathizer. So I get worried about, I like the idea that we're going to constantly see the push and pull of all of these different factors that they have on one another.
Okay, thanks. Other thoughts on what influences factuals, counterfactuals, and how they get used? That's a big question. Let's take another one. Samira had one. We'll just get the mic. Thanks.
So, is it on? It's on. Yeah, okay. So it's kind of like a brainstorming kind of question. We talk about public, but is there any particular part of this public that we need to pay more attention to? And if we identify that part of public, like specific age group that we want to target, should we develop our public engagement strategies to strike that part of public? Like social media versus, television.
It's interesting. Most people here will probably know Julian Savulescu, and he's a very famous bioethicist. And he said to me, Sonia, if you get mostly 18 to 20-year-olds on your citizen jury, you're going to have a very different outcome than if you have 35 to 70-year-olds. It's just really interesting. He just went, it'll be completely different. He said the younger they are, the more open they'll be. The older they are, the less. And I haven't seen the data, so I can't verify that, but he's a pretty reliable source, I think. I don't know the answer, except that I feel like it's people off the street is who I want to talk to. I want to talk to people off the street.
I think everyone's queuing up. Let me, Henrietta, go, and then
Well, I actually think in a subject that will affect everyone's humanity, what it means to be human, then no. The short answer is no. I think this is not a question of targeting, but it's making sure there's a very inclusive approach. So yes, the people on the street, but that's an inclusive people. And if there are people being excluded from this discussion, this ongoing dialogue, I think that would be a bigger shame than saying, actually, we've got to hear from 18 to 24-year-olds. But it's about being inclusive and doing a whole range of mixed methodology approaches. Just very quickly, we have an example of a program we started in 2008. It was an environmental issue, but that started thinking we'd run a few small group discussions. It ended up being a 3-year program for, luckily there was funding. Yeah, with a small group, big group, whole group, an assembly, on street, off street, it being as inclusive as possible. So I think that's my approach.
Simon and Michael both had responses to that. Let me get them. I'm going to ask, we're going to really move into lightning mode here because we'll get a couple more questions. Go ahead.
I'll be lightning. There was a program, I was working with low-income mothers in Compton, and there was a law in California called the parent trigger, that if you're in the bottom 10% of public schools and got more than 50% of parents to sign a petition, the parents took over the school. And I thought that was fascinating. And so we made a film of that, which was a incredible bomb. I don't know how many millions we lost on that thing. But what we did was we showed it to educational opportunity advocates in different states. And then we identified the 4 or 5 votes we were missing to have it passed. And within 2 years, 12 states passed the law.
Thanks. Simon, quickly, and
Two really
then
quick things.
Kevin, we're coming to you next.
So I agree completely with what Henry said, with 2 provisos. Any individual bit of engagement, if you're thinking about influencing policy, needs to have a purpose, and that will then tell you who you should engage. But with something like gene editing, which is going to reach into the corner of everybody's lives, of course it needs to be everybody. But there is a but with that, which is that there are minority voices that if you listen to everybody, the mob may well make decisions that then really negatively affect the minority. And so you need to listen very carefully to those minority voices who may have very different framings, very different sets of issues. And then the real challenge is how on earth do you balance that against the majority perspective? And, you can see where I'm going with the problems.
We're going to answer all these questions by the end of the day. It's going to be good. Kevin, what are we hearing from online?
Yeah. So one poll everywhere question is, what role or opportunities exist for the individual scientists to participate in public engagement? And I know you've mentioned different things, but maybe say a young scientist, maybe in Oakland, who's not geographically located to anything you guys are doing, who isn't trained in this, what should they do? Or should they not do?
Yeah, thanks. Anybody want to take that?
They should post on Twitter.
Post on Twitter.
No, actually, CRISPR Twitter is a thing. There is a community, and I would even say there is a beginning of an epistemic community, people from different backgrounds, many of them from Great Britain, and being part of this MRT debate. So if you're interested, try to look CRISPR hashtags on Twitter, see how those people communicate and what you can learn from them, and this might give you ideas.
Simon, and we'll take one more question after that, yeah.
There are going to be people in the community where this young scientist lives who are interested in the topic. They're going to be interested in the kind of benefits and potential risks and so on. So I think I would say to this young scientist, much of the stuff that Henrietta and I do, it's not rocket science. If you're an open person who's interested in meeting people, frankly, you can do our job, I think. There is a little bit more technology, but really it is very easy. So it's about being open-minded, and it's about understanding that this is about the technology, but it's also about the impact of the technology on society. So listen out for the sorts of questions and comments that surprise you, and think about what the implications are for your work. And that then will mean that you're engaging the public, and you'll change what you do because you're curious.
Great, thanks. Joe had a question in the back there.
It's really a comment. So look where we are. I'm glad that they did the Native American acknowledgement land here, but what was not acknowledged is how much everybody in this room benefits from the Americas. Corn, chocolate, peanuts, potatoes, chilies, tomatoes, corn, all of that stuff came from here, and it's still being extracted. 50% of your pharmaceutics come from here. Most recently, Taxol, which is the Pacific yew, which came from indigenous knowledge. All of that stuff came from here. And this, you mentioned that we're not talking about the benefits. We see that as a benefit because it's a tremendous potential for social justice. Just like with Henrietta Lacks and recently with Wellcome Sanger trying to patent some African genomes for CRISPR and for other things. We need to stop talking about majority minority. The minority is Europe and European Americans who are controlling this conversation. The majority are Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia that are going to provide the catalog for CRISPR to make these changes that are going to help people be healthy. So, for instance, multiple sclerosis, skin cancer, those are European diseases. They get lots of money. But things that are Mendelian diseases in Native Americans or common disease, fairly common diseases, but rare in Europe, don't get any attention for any kind of cure or treatment, but they will get tons of attention for CRISPR.
Thanks, Joe. So we can acknowledge, we can be aware, we can listen, we can engage, we can include, but is it really shifting the dynamics of who ultimately is in control or whose narrative dominates? Guillaume?
Well, first of all, this is true in the US, but it's not true in Europe, where it's much harder to put PI on genes. So maybe the way forward is to acknowledge that genomes and sequences like that cannot be put under PI. And this way, you more or less solve the problem. It becomes a common good. And it's a non-exclusive good. So when you're using it, everyone it doesn't deprive the others to use it as well. So that's also, I'm not saying everything should be a state monopoly, but this is part of a broader argument saying that CRISPR and germline editing and any kind of genome editing is not a product because it doesn't have the features of a product, it's not a service either, it's a power. And the good entity, well, the relevant entity to address the issues of a power is sovereign entities, which is why I don't believe, but this is again, part of a broader debate, that commercial services and private entities are not the relevant ones to manage such power as given by genome editing, as you were saying, because they are capturing resources that don't belong to minorities, but that should belong to, well, the common good. So us as a larger community and not being captured by those who have, and which comes with many privileges, of course, of race, of ethnicity, of descent, etc.
There is a chance to correct some colonial wrongs, though, and get some economic justice, I think, is one of the points that you're making. And M&M Mars is the third largest, I think, private company, so they're not responsive to Wall Street. So they came up with a program called the Economics of Mutuality. They cap their profit at 5%, and the rest of the money goes to the planet and the people that are actually picking the cocoa beans. And it's because they're independent. If they had to answer to Wall Street and their profits had to keep going up, they would not be able to do that.
So we're running out of time, but I think it's an interesting turn of conversation at the end here because it points a little bit to, there's engagement, but there are other considerations of markets and intellectual property and all of these other things that may also have ultimately a lot more power, perhaps even over what we're doing or what we're hearing through engagement. So we have to think about it in that context, I think, is kind of where we're ending this session. I want to thank our panelists once again for your lightning talks and your lightning conversation. I think we're putting a lot of issues and questions on the table for this final session to address, including one thing I just wanted to highlight is this idea of the urgency versus slowing down and kind of running the marathon on engagement. We hear a lot that those are urgent issues that need to be addressed urgently, but what does that really mean? I'd love to hear the next panel take that up. We are headed towards a break. I think we're going to keep it relatively short to probably 10 minutes. Is that right, Lee? Fair? And we'll come back for our final session. Once again, thanks everybody.